Hey CompGovers, so we are starting our AP CompGov review. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to truly compare now that we've gotten all the content down. So I'm going to take us through the 5 different subjects. Y'all remember this: government, and then society. Remember all of those, sovereignty, all of those things. So I'm going to take you through these and we're going to compare each of the 6 different countries. All right, so we're actually going to start, and this is how I'm always going to start the review, with the vocabulary. So I'm actually covering, if you are familiar with the College Board um, curriculum, this is topics 2.1 through 2.2. And so this is basically vocabulary associated with the executive, because that's what this PowerPoint is going to, or this video is going to be about. It's going to be about the executive. So under government, remember there's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And so this video is going to focus in on the executive. So, vocabulary associated with the executive are parliamentary systems, presidential systems, and semi presidential systems. So, parliamentary systems, the UK is one of those that has a parliamentary system, combines the lawmaking and executive functions. So, you have a marriage of lawmaking and executives, which allows the national legislature. In the UK's position, it's the House of Commons. So it allows, under a parliamentary system, it allows the national legislature to select and remove the head of government and the cabinet members. So with a parliamentary system, one of the benefits of it is that it does have fewer institutional obstacles to enact policy. So, for example, it's a more efficient system. You don't have to jump through 1,000 hoops in order to get policy or legislation initiated, because it's kind of streamlined because of this marriage between the executive and the lawmaking functions. As opposed to a presidential system, the presidential system there's a few more obstacles you have to go through. The executive isn't nearly as powerful, perhaps, as in a parliamentary system. Now, the benefits of a presidential system is that it does have checks and balances, because each branch is essentially its own distinct, powerful branch. Parliamentary systems also have some degree of checks and balances, and checks on the executive branch. Remember, in the UK, we've looked at the no confidence vote. So parliaments also can censure cabinet members, which basically means that they can tell cabinet members, usually appointed by the prime minister, or in the presidential system, the president. You can censure them, which means that you can tell those people you have to be quiet, you can't talk anymore, stop publicly saying things. In a parliamentary system, they can refuse to pass executive proposed legislation, so the legislature can choose to do that. And the question, there is also questioning the executive and cabinet members. Remember, in the UK, there was that question time, so there is accountability there. And imposed time deadlines on calling new elections. So parliamentary systems can kind of call elections if needed, and that's usually associated with parliamentary systems. So, presidential systems. This includes some of the countries like Mexico and Nigeria. These feature a cabinet that is mostly responsible to the executive, to the elected executive, with a legislature that can only remove cabinet members through impeachment. These systems have separate fixed terms, popular elections for the national legislature, and a top executive leader serving as both head of state and head of government. So, our own system, the president does serve as head of state and head of government. All right, semi presidential systems are like Russia. They feature separate popular elections for the president and for the national legislature, allowing the president to nominate the prime minister. And so they must usually be approved by the legislature, and members of the cabinet are held accountable by both the president and the legislature. So here is just basically the 3 general systems that are in place. So executives in particular. So, um, governments, these are institutions that organize society. They have executive institutions that include chief executives. So, in a presidential system, it's a president. In a parliamentary system, it's a prime minister. In a semi system, it's both. So, it includes the chief executive plus the cabinet. So, the cabinet is a part of the executive branch. So, these two entities, the executive and the cabinet, formulate and implement and enforce policy through different methods and agencies. So that is what a government does. Now, part of the government is, and what the executive oversees, is bureaucracy. So these are non elected government officials, and they're usually in charge of the day to day operations of government. So they're the administrative policy making group. Government that have most all governments have bureaucracies, and they're used by the executive in different ways. They do have specialized functions, so there is a whole bureaucracy surrounding the State Department, and there's a whole bureaucracy revolved around the EPA. So they are specialized functions. They do have to adhere to fixed rules. There is a hierarchy of authority. Oftentimes, at the very head of various agencies is an appointed cabinet member. A system of administration. It is a system of administration, so largely this is an administrative function. And often you always hear about bureaucratic red tape because there are certain fixed rules. And because these are government agencies, there's a lot of hurdles that you have to cross in order to make sure that you're on the up and up. So executives usually have term limits, and these term limits have advantages and disadvantages. And the idea, depending on which way you go, is to promote stability and effectiveness in governing the country. So some of the advantages of executive term limits are that they check executive power, and they inhibit the emergence of dictators and personality rules, like, the Hitlers of the world. It helps to focus the office holder on governing rather than winning elections. And it provides opportunities for new leaders with new ideas, new policies, new goals. So advantages to term limits. Disadvantages to term limits are that they force good executives to leave office. Allows insufficient time for an office holder to achieve their established goals. It tends to impede policy continuity. So if some policy got put in place by one president, it can be reversed in another presidency. It does tend to weaken accountability. And it creates a lame duck period for the office holder. So when they, when there is, a change in office, that lame duck period. It prevents the office holder from building experience as a chief executive. The longer you do something, the better you get at it. But with executive term limits, that tends to be an issue and can cause poorly designed policies just because of lack of time. Removal of executives. So there are different means of which countries have established ways to remove executives. It's largely removed by the legislative branch, like in the United States, it's the impeachment process. In the UK, it is like the no confidence vote. But they all have different policies and procedures in order to control abuse of power. All right, so those are our definitions associated with the executive. So now let's look at our case studies. So first up, the UK. Now, technically they have a dual executive, but we often refer to it as a no dual executive because the head of state doesn't really have much power. The Queen doesn't really have much power. So they often refer to it as a no dual executive, although yes, there are two executives in the UK. So let's start with head of government. So the head of government is the prime minister. So they are a parliamentary system. Boris Johnson recently recovered from COVID. is usually formally appointed by the monarch, believe it or not, but that recommendation is essentially the because that person is the head of the majority party who wins in the election or heads the coalition holding the largest number of seats in the House of Commons. So whether it's just a singular party that wins a majority or a coalition of parties that win a majority, whoever heads that up becomes the recommendation for the prime ministership, and then the queen formally appoints. So the prime minister must be an MP. They must have been elected in their jurisdiction. Um, so they are a minister of parliament, right? They can be removed through a loss of confidence vote by the House of Commons. They do appoint cabinet members, and those cabinet members are usually MPs or ministers of parliament. They have 5 year unlimited. Their terms are 5 years, but it's unlimited. The prime minister can call elections, sets foreign policy, and serves as a de facto commander in chief and chief executive over civil service, so the day to day operations of government. Um, okay, and then we have a head of state. Head of state is Queen Elizabeth II. She's a monarch and serves ceremonially. She appoints the prime minister formally, is and that's basically it. She does actually sign, through the recommendation of the prime minister, does sign legislation, but it's all ceremonial. All right, Russia. Oh, what happened to my? There he is. All right, so next up is Russia. So they do have a dual executive. They have a head of state and a head of government. So the head of state is the president, as usual. And in this case, now it's, of course, Vladimir Putin. And his powers are becoming expanded. Traditionally, the president of Russia appoints the prime minister, who is the head of government, appoints the cabinet, is commander in chief, conducts foreign policy, presides over the Duma under certain conditions, does have the power to issue decrees that have the force of law, can dissolve the Duma, and realize that a recent occurrence was some constitutional amendments that were proposed by Vladimir Putin in March of 2020. And in order to legitimize them, he's going to put these constitutional amendments before a referendum in which there will be a nationwide vote. And part of these constitutional amendments would allow him to run again for president. He has set the election date for April 22nd. So that has happened. And despite constitutional term limits, he can get reelected. And his term could actually extend until 2036. So the prime minister has recently changed as of January 2020 because the old prime minister had resigned. His name was Medvedev. The new one is Ms. Houston, right? And he, as the head of government, does do the day-to-day operations of government, oversees civil service, proposes legislation, and he does have a 6-year term with a 2-term limit. Then we have China. So China, everything is a lot more closed. Like change of leadership, choosing leadership, it's all happening behind closed doors. These top leaders are not elected, right? Remember, elections only happen at the lowest level. There are no national elections. So they also have a head of state and a head of government. So the head of state is the president, of course, and Xi Jinping. So he is commander in chief. He is chair of China's military commission. He is the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. He nominates the premier or the prime minister, and as of 2018 has no term limits. The head of government or the premier is this guy. I forgot to write his name down, and it's his first name. His last name is Li, Li, and then I cannot pronounce the second part of his name. So Li and Xi. Just think of it that way. He oversees the day-to-day operations of government, so civil service, and he has a 2-year or 2-term limit. Right, he's got a 2-term limit. All right, let's move on to Mexico. So Mexico is, as you can see, um, only one executive, so no dual executive here. He is the president and is head of state and head of government, and his name is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, or simply AMLO. So he, remember, is elected in a sexencio, which is a only one 6-year term. And he tends to be pretty powerful because, there is no dual executive here. He initiates legislation, appoints the cabinet, issues decrees with the force of law, much like Russia, nominates Supreme Court justices, serves as commander in chief, leader of the bureaucracy, so all the day-to-day operations of government, and can approve domestic legislation, and he also leads foreign policy. So here he is, AMLO. Nigeria. So Nigeria, much like Mexico, is a presidential system, but much like Mexico, Nigeria has one executive, the president, who is head of state and head of government, and in this case, it's Buhari. So Buhari is elected to 4-year terms with 2-term limits, as opposed to sexencio with 1 term allowed. He does have to receive at least 25% of the vote in 2/3 of the states. That way, it avoids regional candidates because remember, regionalism is a huge part of Nigeria. He appoints cabinet members, and remember, he must include people from all 36 states so that it is equally distributed because they have such regional problems. So this is a powerful position as well, just like in Mexico. So commander-in-chief, power to veto, refer a bill to the Constitutional Court to consider its constitutionality. So there's a bleeding here into the judiciary. Calls the National Assembly for special sessions, pardons. For criminal cases, he's the head of civil service, so operates the day-to-day operations of government, can approve domestic legislation, conducts foreign policy. So just like Mexico, this is a pretty powerful position. All right, finally, Iran. So Iran has a dual executive. So like Russia, there are 2 leaders here, but like Russia, one is really more powerful than the other. So in Russia, it's whichever position Putin takes, and it's usually the presidency. And in Iran, the real power comes from the supreme leader. So supreme leader is head of state, and this is Khamenei. He is chosen, not elected. He is chosen. That is basically as of the constitutional amendment in 1989. He's chosen now by the Assembly of Religious Experts and can be removed by the Assembly of Religious Experts. But realize he basically controls the Assembly of Religious Experts, so there's not a lot of, removal happening here. He is the Imam, so he heads the Shia religious organizations, kind of like a caliphate. The Faqih, this is where he is the leading Islamic jurist to interpret Sharia law. So he heads those Shia Muslims. He is basically can create a list of presidential candidates, eliminate those he doesn't like from the list, commands the armed forces. He appoints and removes administrators, civil service, judges. He sets basically all government agenda. Serves as, I already said this, I think, commander in chief. Is that it? He kind of heads up the Expediency Council. He appoints half of the Guardian Council and is the head of the judiciary. So we do see a lot of bleeding here, just like we saw in Nigeria, a lot of bleeding here in the judiciary. So the president currently is Hassan Rouhani. He is head of government. He is directly elected, serves for 2 4-year terms. He basically is in charge of the economy, creates the budget, supervises the economy, does propose legislation, but so can the supreme leader. He can select cabinet and VP, but so can the supreme leader. Appoints ambassadors with the supreme leader's approval, does conduct foreign policy with the supreme leader's approval. I already said, sees to the day-to-day operations of government. So there it is, Rouhani. So that is our 6 countries, and hopefully you have a better understanding of the executive. Next video, we're going to do the legislature. All right, see you around, guys. Stay safe.